Not up here, but any special points that came out of that breaking of the ice? You're just about getting into it, but you see, we looked at cell phones, and then we looked at Jesus, the real Jesus, and then we started dealing with these terms about justice and fairness, and then we were looking at the whole idea of how do we soak up love, how do we become better lovers of ourselves and others, and certainly of God. Any particular comments or questions on that? Yes?
Really quick, we were just talking about, some other comments I had is like our expectations for pastors or ministers ends up being more of like coordinators, right? We plan retreats, we plan events, and then we take all this time is programming versus just being a shepherd, ministering to the people. That's something I think our church, our youth group has been struggling a lot with. Our youth pastors recognize that he hasn't met with all the youth. He doesn't know all of their names. And that's something he recognized, that he was too busy up in the clouds making sure all these things were just going on, and he was too separated from the youth.
And so what if you went to a church and you said, hey, look, I've just gotten through CUME and I feel like I'm equipped and I've got a passion, I've got a calling and so forth. I will come to be your church, but you've got to run the church. I'm going to be your pastor. And we're going to have programs that you take care of and that the young people plan themselves and so forth. You run. And I'm going to look for a couple of people to be elders with me to reach people's hearts and to get out in the community and get into their homes and families and see what's really going on. And then I'll bring back what I'm finding out, and program and shepherding will get together, and we'll brainstorm and pray deeply about how these two things can intersect. That's pretty radical. But maybe something like that could happen. Okay, so we're leaving this then, which is, I guess, really practical to you. And now we're going to step into the culture. And if any of you have read the Foundations book and so forth, you know that I'm very, very excited about culture. I love talking about it, and I'm going to do that now as we look at this. I stress in the book that a baby cannot become human without cultural socialization. Did you think about that? And do you remember feral children? There have been children that were left in the jungles of India, but that's documented. They never became human, fully human capacity, even after an Indian pastor took them in, and his wife was a social worker. And they would only be continent, go to the toilet, if they were around. As soon as they left, they'd go back to their socialization from the wolf. But there's been others. Peter in the forests of Germany, and a woman, eccentric woman, raised a baby without touching that baby in a box in the attic. And all these things have been studied. And so that gives us the fact that God had to create culture around individuals. And that individuals don't become individuals without being taught they know how to suck, they know how to grab, but they don't know anything more about walking, eating, teaching, talking, and much more and so forth. That comes from culture. You really got that deep? So God's got his heart set on culture, obviously. Family is culture. Everything I've got on me and my ring and this and all is culture, except my natural body stripped naked and take out the cavities and a few other things. And you'll get my natural body. But, some people are very technologically complemented inside with pacemakers and everything else. So God not only created Adam and Eve, and that's how we teach it, that's how we preach it, and so forth, but God created the culture of the garden. And it was a blessed model of culture. And then, fallen, when we rebelled, God created fallen urban culture through the offsprings of Cain, and then a counterculture through the offsprings of Seth. But all cultures, even Cain had a divine mark on him. All cultures in the city and awe, and Babylon today has got some image of God in it. You're very right to say that the things that I hate about advertising and about capitalism and about socialism and everything else, Jesus is totally against that. He says the Gentiles do all that stuff. They rule it over people, they oppress people, they marginalize people, they aggrandize themselves. It should not be so among you. Those who follow me must be servants of all. Period. It's countercultural. It's different. Yes?
I saw something's wrong on the culture right now in the United States because, okay, they reject the immigrant, they reject no white. Jesus was no American and Jesus was no white.
Good.
Okay, and if I reject the immigrant, if I reject no white people, I'm rejecting Jesus too because he belongs to this category.
Thank you. Thank you. And God is so strong to Israel, saying, remember, you were immigrants. You were sojourners. You were aliens. You were undocumented in Egypt. And so you must be kind and share with the immigrants. And after we have impoverished Latin America and so much of Africa and the islands through our imperialistic tendencies, making ourselves rich in the Euro-American system that we have, then we have created, and then with our wars and our exports of pornography and everything else like that, the slave trade and all, we create the very problems that are driving desperate people to come in, and then we say, no, no. Go back to your a-holes. Anyway, I'm going just a little bit too far off. But God's got his mind on this culture. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, if I'm disquieted by anything that's going on in Washington today, and the people of Kentucky, Southern Illinois, and so forth, Martin Luther King Jr. said, you can only change people you love. So God's got stuff to do with you and us, because we've got to overcome, not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the good is love and fairness. And we've got to be a counterculture. And the sadness is that our churches are divided against themselves. And some of our churches are sadly divided within themselves. And we just have to get back to repentance and lament and ask God that if his people, if we would finally humble ourselves and pray and seek his face and turn from our evil, hostile, aggressive ways, then he might hear from heaven and heal not our churches, our land, our country. So we have to get political, don't we, in theology and with the gospel. And we're divided. I know we're divided. But we've got to talk about that division and love across that division and try to understand across that division and take, hopefully, the good things from this side and the good things of this side. Admit the bad things on this side. Admit the bad things on that side because they're there. I study that all the time and come together in love and forbearance and with a tolerant orthodoxy. Stand firm in the faith. Well, thank you for that. So, think to me about my life, okay? I started youth work in the 1940s, attended in the 1930s. And so I've watched. And then when I got to teach, I began to remember and think back and so forth. Do you understand that it was universal high school education that produced the growing adolescent culture? We separated kids that were with their family until they went to an apprentice. Now we can't go back. I'm not saying go back to the good old days. I'm just saying that was a change fueled by technological change. And here was an incredible educational value where you took kids away from their families and before they went to work and you put them in a high school, and what did they do? They started football teams and they got cheerleaders and the cheerleaders got unis. And then it was just at the same time, go back and study the 30s and 40s when music was going pop, it was going swing, and the blues and the music of the rhythm of African Americans and the tunes of the Irish Americans. And all this was coming together in a beautiful way. and in a way that fed both gospel and pop in incredible ways. And all of a sudden, there weren't before my father was born, radio. And all of a sudden there was radio that could play music. And then kids were going after school down to the Cornerstone and having ice cream sodas, and they're putting a nickel into the jukebox and playing their favorite songs and dancing. It was quite a time. But do you understand this, what we're getting at? We're watching culture evolve and change. And so there was the coming of school sports, dance, swing, music. I'm going on. Then radio, then records, jukeboxes, then TV, then the Walkman. Everybody's walking around with a Walkman, no buds. The internet, buds, and phones. And all of this fed by peer pressure. And my colleagues, friends, are coming out of their home school and their conservative church, and they're breathing it all in. And they're picking up the culture, of course. It's like the water fish swim in, as you go up and heard. The fish don't know what water is. They take it for granted. And most of us haven't really thought much about culture. We take it for granted. And all of this that we're talking about is coming through technological progress and its effects on youth and pop culture. Meanwhile, there's something else that's happening. There are some big things that are happening in history that at first young people have to hear about, and then maybe they get it from the newspapers, but there's some big things happening. So along with the technological change to the way that they're listening to music and all these other things, certain things are happening. The recession, where my mother and father, strong Christians, but they stopped having kids. They've never really explained that to me, but then Mom got a vision and we had a whole bunch of kids coming all at once. And at the same time, my father's tool company was starting to bloom after the recession. But the recession produced the builder, silent generation. That's my stuff. I'm not early builder, but I'm there. And then there was World War II, and the GIs coming back were part of the boomer generation that had your parents as kids, some of you. And then this is very important, because here's where a couple of things come together. The Vietnam War, what years? 1960s into 70s. Okay. This war becomes horrible. By the way, have any of you seen one of the pictures that a photographer took after a napalm attack, like my brother was called upon to do as a Marine pilot, 182 missions, and then on ground control, calling in the napalm on places, grandparents, kids around, but the South Korean Army was telling my brother, call them in now, because there's Viet Cong in those hiding in there. And my youngest brother lost his soul, and he's still suffering from post-traumatic. He loves the Lord, thank God, but he's different than he ever was. That's a long story. But there was this napalm attack, and these kids were burned up in this village. And then running out of the village, you saw this little girl burning. Anybody see that picture?
Yes.
It's a classic. You could go look at it. Classic. And the other day, driving back from Boston to my home, I heard her on NPR, interviewed by a secular commentator, talk host. And she's had 30-some operations, not to make her look right, but to relieve the intense pain that she is suffering from, what that did to her skin, muscles, tendons, and all. And in that process of operations, she had come from this little remote pagan religion, and she went to the library and looked at for some religious books, and she happened to get a Bible. And she read the Bible and she found Christ. And she is the most joyful, happy woman still having operations, and leading an organization that's working with some of his others just like the life he did. So, get to another point about this Vietnam War. The kids of this generation watched the pictures of the war while their parents were reading the papers and the explanations of McNamara and Johnson. You get that? The parents were in favor of the war. The kids saw it, smelt it, felt it, and they started a whole youth movement, anti-war people that Martin Luther King in the latter part of his ministry fed into, and so forth. And then out of that came the Jesus movement. And the Jesus movement were rebels with Jesus. And they had pictures of Jesus, I remember in those times. Jesus, the radical. Looked like Che Guevara or something. Jesus, the radical. And so, are you following what we're talking about? The technology moves young people along. And then there are events. And then came 9/11. And the kids who watched that as kids were a little different than the kids before. And then there was the recession of 2008. So a remarkable thing that Gene Twang is saying is that this current generation, in general, tends to be more interested in money than it does about happiness. It's just the statistics are reversed. And that's an amazing thing. And so we have to ponder all these things. How do we get to where we are so that we can understand ourselves better where we are now? You see that? And do you see these two currents? That technology is moving the kids along, the technology with advertising and its programs and so forth, moving the kids along. And then there are the macro, you might say, the historic events that also affect each generation. And that's a lot to get a hold of, but I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So into buzz. Oh, by the way, Dr. Ward, when do you take a break?
8:15 and then 7:30, 8:15 and then.
Okay, so we got 5 minutes in the buzz group. So do you think an understanding of cultures and subcultures is important for biblical and theological understanding? What questions do you have about the interaction of technological and historical effects on culture and the lives of youth? And do you think the seminary should be concentrating and teaching and studying and researching culture a little bit more than it does? Okay? Into your groups. It's doing a great job.
뭐가 다른 거예요? 네? Understanding of culture랑 self-conscious가 뭐가 다르요?
한국말은 굳이 프렌치까지 안 하고
하위 밑에 있다는 거죠. 그러니까 무슨 수를 얘기하는 거예요?
아니요, 그냥 컬처도 서브컬처도 그것이 비블리칼 theological understanding하고 어떻게
아까 그거랑 비슷한 게 얘기한 거 그러니까 지금 제너레이션이 설교하거나 이런 거 할 때 그냥
맥락 없이
그냥 뭐 없이 스킬 이런 거 아무것도 없이 그냥 그걸로만 하면
간다.
입에 그러니까 제가 그냥 얘기하는
그것도
그래서 그런 것처럼 얘네들이 학교에서도 파워포인트를 배우고 뭐 학교에서도 뭐 비디오 코드로 배우면 교회에서도 뭔가 좀 이렇게 도와주는 그런
근데 꼭 그런 미디어뿐만 아니라요. 그러니까 걔네들에 대한 인사이트가 있어야 돼요. 그러니까 예를 들어 설교를 하더라도 그냥 예수님의 이런 거보다요. 쿠킹 자체를 걔네들 용어나 뭐 걔네들 이슈나 이런 거부터 그냥 애들이 몰입해가지고. 네, 근데 그러니까 약간 메이커 보이스를 식으로 이렇게 얘기를 하면 이제 걔네들의 문화를 잘 지금 계속 얘기하는 게 걔네들의 문화라든가 무슨 생각을 하고 있고 뭐가 관심사고 이런 거를 뉴스 미니스터가 잘 알아야 걔네들이 진짜 집중할 수 있는 그런 거를 하고
말씀 더잘 아시겠지만 말씀 볼 때도 이렇게 그 당시에 문화를 이해하는 더 시각적으로 보는 것도 왜 이렇게 했었는지 하나님이 이런 것도 먹지 말라고 했었는지 이스라엘에서 포도주를 먹어야 했는지 이런 것들을 더 이해가 되는 것도 그런 예수님도 설철을 다 아셨어요.
예를 들어 우리 아들이 얼마 전에 엄마 예수님은 남녀 차별주의자야. 그래서 고린도 전서에 그 여자 뭐 하지 말고 나대지 마라 이거 있잖아요. 그거를 어떻게 하는지 뭐 그런 것도 있고 뭐 교회에서 떠들지 말고 그런 거 있잖아요. 그거를 어떻게 알았는지 아마 구글에 무신론 그런 사이트에서 공개하게 지가 보지도 않은 막 그런 걸 가지고 물어보는 거예요. 이제 설명하고 그때 맥락은 그렇고 그러니까 지금 말씀하시는 게 그게 그냥 뜬금없이 나온 게 아니고 콘텍스트가 있구나. 막 연구하고 설명했더니 조금 알아듣긴 하던데 그러니까 지금 말씀하시는 거는 그때 보면은 우리가 이해 못하는 막 그런 거 있잖아요. 그런 것들에 애들이 의문이 되게 많아요. 뭐 예를 들면 이해는 눈에는 왜 그랬냐 뭐 그런 것도 물어보고 왜 가나안 족속을 다 진멸하라 했느냐 뭐 이런 걸 조금 물어보는데 그거에 대해서 모르겠어요. 이제 뭐 깊게 뭐 설계를 들어갈 수 있어서 그때 왜 그랬는지에 대한 맥락이라든가 그런 게 아니면 이런 지네들끼리도 뭐 이렇게 무신론 그런 사이트 공격하는 사이트가 있잖아요. 얘네들이 그런 것 때문에 아무튼 좀 난해한 이슈들을 계속 질문해요. 그거를 방어하느라고 레퓨테이션 하느라고 그게 어디를 표현을 안 해서
그런 거를 하다 보면
You should teach your congregation how to think about this.
그런 걸 그냥
Especially when it comes to Christian ethics.